about all kinds of stuff. Professor Dave explains.
The history of places that produced their own written sources has been studied since the 19th century by combining those sources with the material culture they left behind them. This includes buildings, tools, art, furnishings, and so on. But in some cases, the written sources are so much more familiar than the material ones that they tend to dominate our ideas about the time and place that produced them. One of the most famous ancient texts in Western history is the Hebrew Bible, which has been studied for centuries as both a work of literature and a record of the ideas and the history of the Israelites for the 800 years or so before their society came to an end in the 6th century BCE. The Bible was the only source for the Israelites and their neighbors who are described as Canaanites, or are given more specific names such as Amorites. According to the book of Genesis, the Israelites originated in Canaan as nomadic shepherds who lived in the hills of the southern part of the country, and were the members of a single extended family under the leadership of Abraham, who had traveled there from the Mesopotamian city of Ur. But his descendants, after spending hundreds of years in Egypt as slaves, came back to Canaan as a people with its own God, its own leader, Moses, and its own distinctive identity. This identity put them at odds with the Canaanites, who were already living there since they worshipped other gods and refused to accept the Israelites' sovereignty over the land they claimed that God had given them. The authors of the Bible did believe that they shared a common ancestry with the nearby kingdoms of the Ammonites and the Moabites, who, according to Genesis, were the descendants of Lot, the nephew of Abraham. But they drew a fundamental distinction between these two people, whom the Pentateuch bars from joining the Israelite community despite their historical connection, and the group of 7 peoples whom it often associates with the land of Canaan. These are the Hivites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Girgashites, Canaanites, used here in a more specific sense, the Amorites, and the Hittites, who apparently were a different group from the people who founded the Hittite Empire in Asia Minor 1,000 years prior. In other words, these 7 peoples are described by the Pentateuch, which was first composed around the 6th century BCE, as being entirely different from the Israelites. In fact, God tells the latter that they are supposed to wipe out the Canaanites because they have polluted the land with their wicked sexual and religious practices. And for the same reason, the Pentateuch directs the Israelites to carefully distinguish their own behavior from that of the Canaanites, which it describes as offensive to God. Archaeological evidence, on the other hand, suggests that at least some of the people that would eventually consider themselves Israelites were originally a part of the ethnic and linguistic groups that had been inhabiting the land of Canaan since at least 8000 BCE, when the city of Jericho was built, and we know from our Egyptian and Mesopotamian sources that the area was known by that name, whose meaning is uncertain, from at least the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE. The religious and social life of the Canaanites was essentially consistent. They were farmers and shepherds who lived in the hill country, in fortified towns that were independent city-states ruled by kings who lived in palaces, though one Canaanite people, the Phoenicians, lived on the coast of what is now Lebanon, and built an empire based on trading throughout the Mediterranean. In fact, they founded mercantile colonies in Sicily, Spain, and North Africa. The Canaanites also had temples and sacred places, which could be open-air shrines, where their priests sacrificed animals on square stone altars with horns. And they all spoke dialects of the same Semitic language, which in the case of the Israelites was later called Hebrew. The bits of written texts left behind on seals and pieces of pottery by Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites testify to the close similarity between their languages and Hebrew, and the alphabet in which they wrote was the same 22-letter script used by the Phoenicians. Because they lived on a bridge of land that joined Africa with Asia, the people of Canaan often traded with Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Aegean island of Crete, and with the Hittite Empire. They primarily sold agricultural products like wine and oil, as well as cloth that was dyed purple with the secretions of a local mollusk. This color was called Tyrian purple, after one of the largest Phoenician cities. They had a particularly close relationship with Egypt during the New Kingdom of the later 2nd millennium BCE, after King Thutmose III and his successors brought Canaan under their control, and we know about the Egyptian court's administration of that area from the correspondence known as the Amarna letters, which were found at the capital of King Akhenaten. Many of these letters, which were written in the cuneiform used in Canaan at the time, were addressed to the local kings, who were considered the pharaoh's vassals. We also have cuneiform documents from Mesopotamia which mention people called Amurru. These are thought to have been identical with the Amorites, who originally lived in what is now Syria, but gradually moved into and dominated southern Mesopotamia in the first centuries of the 2nd millennium. One of them, Hammurabi, was responsible for turning the city of Babylon into an important political center. There are, on the other hand, references in both Egyptian and Mesopotamian documents to Apiru or Habiru, who seem to have been not an ethnic group but a class of poor or rootless people who might be robbers but could also be nomads, slaves, or mercenaries. This term may be the source of the biblical word Ivri, or Hebrew, which is used to describe Abraham in the book of Genesis, and Abraham is in fact a nomadic shepherd who becomes the chief of a large group and goes to war against some of the local kings. Many modern scholars believe that what came to separate the Israelites from other Canaanites toward the end of the 2nd millennium BCE was not their language or culture, but their religious ideology. Israelite villages were devoted to their god Yahweh rather than to the pantheon of Canaanite gods. Although they did sometimes combine him with the goddess Asherah, the Bible, and especially the books of Deuteronomy and Kings, are vocally opposed to such combinations, and to worshipping even Yahweh anywhere but the temple in Jerusalem. About 250 of these Israelite villages began to appear throughout the hill country of Canaan beginning around 1200 BCE. One of the indicators used by archaeologists to identify them is the absence of pig bones in their trash heaps, since Israelites did not eat pigs, while Canaanites relied heavily on them. The Bible clearly distinguishes the Israelites from their neighbors by describing in detail the process by which they conquered the land of Canaan several centuries prior. It dedicates to this story of conquest the book of Joshua, according to which Canaanite cities like Lachish, Hazor, and Gezer were destroyed by the army of Joshua, Moses' lieutenant and successor, as it advanced into the land over the course of his lifetime, creating Israelite towns. But this book, like the Bible's other historical narratives, is thought to have been written centuries later, not long before the two Israelite kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, came to an end between the 8th and 6th centuries. And the Israelites' account of their origins had to explain how they went from slaves in Egypt to a nation living on its own land. At the same time, the ruins of Hazor and Lachish, which are listed among Joshua's conquests, date from around the 13th century BCE, the time when the Israelites are supposed to have entered the land. But it's not at all clear that the destruction of the towns dug up by archaeologists happened within a single generation, and given that cities all over the eastern Mediterranean and Asia Minor were being destroyed or abandoned at that time as part of the phenomenon called the Bronze Age collapse, there is nothing to connect these Canaanite towns with an Israelite invasion. For that matter, cities like Jericho and Ai, which are featured in the book of Joshua, had been abandoned for hundreds of years at that point, while others that were destroyed in the late 2nd millennium are not mentioned there at all. The book of Joshua is followed by the book of Judges, which describes a period of about 100 years, when it is believed that the people were led by a series of leaders called shoftim, a word that is usually translated, somewhat inaccurately, as judges. Each of the 12 tribes among whom Joshua divided the country was independent. The writers of the Bible, who lived around the 7th and 6th centuries when the country was ruled by kings, saw the monarchy as central to Israelite society. They stressed the disorder and conflict of the period of the Judges, and they described the Philistines, who lived on the coast near Egypt, as mortal enemies of the Israelites, who were only neutralized when King David came to power. The book of Judges also connects the absence of a king and of the temple that would later be built by the first kings, David and Solomon, with the worship of idols at the Bamo, or high places, that were used in towns across the country. On the other hand, the book of Samuel, who appointed Saul, the first king, describes the city of Shiloh as the temporary home of the tabernacle, which was thought to contain the presence of Yahweh and was therefore the center of his worship. It is described in the Pentateuch, which was written several centuries later, as having existed since the time of Moses, who established it as soon as the people had left Egypt. When the temple was finally built in the 10th century, the tabernacle was installed there. There was also, by the time of Samuel, a high priest who was in charge of the tabernacle. This institution is also backdated in the Bible to the time of Moses, whose brother Aaron served as the first priest. But while the tabernacle in Shiloh seems to have been looked after by a single priestly family, by the time of the temple there was an entire priestly class that served in Jerusalem and throughout the country. The members of this class traced their ancestry back to Aaron, while the Levites, who assisted them, belonged to the tribe of Levi. This tribe, unlike the others, did not have its own land, because its mission was to serve God and instruct the people in the law. So, like the priests, it lived off of the food that was taken as a tax from the other tribes. Each of these tribes, and each family within a tribe, had a set territory within the country which they believed had been assigned to them by Joshua at the time of the conquest. And though a family could sell its property, all the land in the country was supposed to return to its ancestral owners on the Jubilee that took place every 50 years. While the biblical account of the origins of the Israelites, their entry into the land of Canaan, and the establishment of an Israelite state is a much later reconstruction of the past, which was meant to explain and to justify the ideology and beliefs of the Israelite monarchy, the Bible has more current, specific, and reliable information about that monarchy, its history, and its institutions. Let's now move forward and learn more about the Israelites.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.